At 14:30 on September 19, 1944, Captain Everett Pope crouched at the base of Hill 100 on Peleliu Island, watching Japanese machine gun positions track his 90 remaining Marines across the open coral. 25 years old, 3 Pacific campaigns, zero doubt this would be the hardest fight of his life. The Japanese 14th Infantry Division had fortified the steep ridge with interlocking bunkers, 70mm guns, and enough ammunition to hold for months. Hill 100 rose 300 feet above the surrounding terrain, bare coral, no cover. The Japanese called it East Mountain. They had spent 4 months carving firing positions into the rock face. Every approach was a killing zone. The 1st Marine Division had already lost 2,000 men in 4 days trying to take Peleliu. Major General William Rupertus had promised the island would fall in 4 days. He was wrong. The Japanese had abandoned their old tactics. No more suicidal banzai charges on the beaches. Instead, they had built a fortress in the interior ridges. Pope's Company C had landed with 235 Marines on September 15th. 4 days of combat had reduced them to 90. 60 men were already dead or wounded. The battalion had suffered 71% casualties attacking these ridges. Pope knew the numbers. He knew what Hill 100 meant. Whoever controlled that ridge controlled the southern approach to Bloody Nose Ridge. The Japanese knew it too. 2 Sherman tanks were supposed to support the assault. Both slipped off a narrow causeway on the approach, immobilized. Pope's Marines crossed the causeway anyway. Somehow, miraculously, not a single man was hit crossing that exposed ground. The Japanese were saving their ammunition. They wanted the Marines closer. They wanted to make sure every bullet counted. The ascent began at 1500 hours. Point-blank cannon fire from adjacent ridges raked the Marines from the west and southwest. Mortar rounds exploded against the coral, sending razor-sharp fragments in every direction. Machine gun fire came from 3 directions simultaneously. The Marines climbed anyway. They had no choice. The order was clear: take the hill. Pope led from the front. His men followed. Every 10 feet of elevation cost another Marine. A machine gun burst would cut down 2 men. A mortar would wound 3 more. The coral was too hard to dig into. There was nowhere to hide. The Marines just kept climbing. By the time they reached what they thought was the summit, Company C had lost over 60 men. More than 2/3 of Pope's remaining force was gone. That's when Pope realized the maps were wrong. Hill 100 wasn't a hill. It was a long, narrow ridge. The summit they had just taken was surrounded by higher ground. Japanese positions occupied every piece of elevated terrain around them. Pope and his 24 surviving Marines were trapped on an exposed finger of coral with enemy forces on 3 sides. The sun was setting. Darkness would come in less than 2 hours. Pope had 1 light machine gun, several Thompson submachine guns, M1 rifles, a limited supply of hand grenades, no water, no way to resupply, no radio contact with Battalion. The Japanese had probably 500 men in the surrounding positions, maybe more. They would attack after dark. Pope knew it. His Marines knew it. If you want to see how Pope's rock tricks saved his men through the night, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Pope. The Marines began gathering coral rocks. Loose chunks of stone scattered across the ridge. Pope realized they could use them. Mix the rocks with the grenades. Throw them both at attacking Japanese. In the darkness, the enemy wouldn't know which was which. It was desperate. It was crude. But it might buy them enough time to survive until dawn. Pope looked at his 24 Marines, young faces, exhausted, terrified, determined. He had 1 night to hold this position, and he had an idea that would either save them or get them all killed in the next 12 hours. Darkness fell at 1900 hours. Pope positioned his Marines in a thin perimeter around the ridge. 24 men to defend a position that needed at least a full platoon. Each Marine was responsible for covering 15 to 20 feet of front. Any more spread out, and the Japanese could walk through the gaps. Any closer together, and a single mortar round could kill half the force. Pope placed the light machine gun on the northern approach. That was the most likely avenue of attack. The ridge sloped down to the north, giving the Japanese a natural approach route. 2 Marines with Thompson submachine guns covered the eastern flank. The rest carried M1 Garand rifles, standard Marine Corps infantry weapons. Effective at close range, useless if they ran out of ammunition. The hand grenades were the real problem. Pope counted them. 42 grenades total, less than 2 per man. In a sustained night defense, 42 grenades would last maybe 30 minutes. The Japanese would probe first, small groups of 3 or 4 men testing the perimeter. Then they would mass for a larger assault, 20 or 30 men at once. The Marines would throw grenades to break up the attack. Then the Japanese would regroup and try again, and again, all night long. That's when Pope looked at the coral rocks scattered across the ridge, chunks of stone the size of grenades, slightly lighter, same rough shape in the darkness. He picked one up, tested the weight. Close enough. He turned to the nearest Marine and explained the plan. Throw 3 or 4 rocks, then throw 1 grenade. The Japanese would hear the impacts. They wouldn't know which throws were rocks and which were explosives. They would have to assume every thrown object was deadly. It would force them to take cover, buy the Marines precious seconds. The Marines stared at Pope. The idea sounded insane. Throw rocks at Japanese soldiers armed with rifles and grenades. But the alternative was worse. Run out of grenades in the first hour and fight the rest of the night with nothing. The Marine nodded, started gathering rocks. The others followed. Within 20 minutes, each fighting position had a small pile of coral stones next to the grenade supply. Pope walked the perimeter, checked each position, made sure his Marines understood the plan. Rocks first, grenades second. Conserve ammunition. Don't fire unless you have a clear target. The night would be long. The Japanese would keep coming. Survival meant discipline. The wounded officer was First Lieutenant Francis Burke, shrapnel wound to the leg. Still conscious, still able to fight. Burke took position on the western side of the perimeter. That flank was slightly lower than the rest, more vulnerable. Burke knew it. He stayed anyway. Pope returned to the center of the position. 24 Marines, 1 wounded officer, 42 grenades, a few hundred rounds of rifle ammunition, maybe 200 rounds for the Thompson guns, 1 belt for the light machine gun. Not enough for a full night's defense, not even close. Pope had fought at Guadalcanal. He had fought at Cape Gloucester. He had seen what the Japanese did to isolated Marine positions. They attacked in waves. They never stopped. They never retreated. They fought until every defender was dead or they ran out of men. Hill 100 was 300 feet above the valley floor. If the Japanese overran this position, they would control the southern approach to Bloody Nose Ridge. The entire 1st Marine Division's advance would stall. Hundreds more Marines would die trying to retake this ground. Pope couldn't let that happen. At 2100 hours, the first Japanese probe came up the northern slope. 5 men, moving quietly through the darkness. The machine gunner saw them at 30 yards. Pope held up his hand. Wait. Let them get closer. At 15 yards, the machine gun opened fire. 3 Japanese soldiers fell. The other 2 retreated down the slope. The night defense of Hill 100 had begun. The second attack came at 2140. Larger group, 12 to 15 Japanese soldiers moving up the eastern slope. They were testing a different approach, looking for weak points in the Marine perimeter. The 2 Marines with Thompson guns spotted movement at 40 yards. Pope gave the signal. Both Marines grabbed coral rocks from their piles, threw them hard toward the advancing Japanese. The rocks clattered against the coral slope, loud impacts in the darkness. The Japanese immediately hit the ground, took cover behind whatever terrain they could find. They were waiting for the explosions. 3 seconds passed. 4 seconds. No explosions. The Japanese started to rise. That's when the Marines threw the actual grenades. 2 Mark II fragmentation grenades arced through the darkness. 4.5-second fuses. Both exploded directly over the Japanese position. Shrapnel tore through the exposed soldiers. Screams cut through the night. The survivors retreated back down the slope. The rock trick had worked. The Japanese thought the first throws were duds. They exposed themselves. The real grenades caught them in the open. Pope watched from the center of the perimeter. The tactic had bought his Marines 5 critical seconds. 5 seconds where the enemy was confused, hesitant, off balance. In night combat, 5 seconds was the difference between survival and annihilation. He passed the word around the perimeter. Keep using the rocks. Mix them with the grenades. Make the Japanese guess. At 22:15, a larger assault hit the northern slope. 20 to 25 Japanese soldiers. A coordinated attack. Not a probe. A genuine attempt to overrun the position. The light machine gunner opened fire at 35 yards. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness. Japanese soldiers fell. The others kept coming. They were screaming. Battle cries meant to terrify the defenders. The Marines held their ground. Pope ran to the northern edge of the perimeter. 4 Marines were throwing rocks as fast as they could grab them. 1 rock, another rock, a third, then a grenade. The pattern repeated. The Japanese couldn't advance. Every time they tried to move forward, something was flying at them through the darkness. Most were rocks. Some were grenades. They had no way to tell which was which until impact. The uncertainty paralyzed them. The machine gun ran through its first belt. 100 rounds gone in less than 2 minutes. The gunner reloaded, started firing again. Japanese soldiers were now within 20 yards of the Marine position, close enough to throw their own grenades. 2 Japanese grenades landed inside the perimeter. Both exploded. 1 Marine was wounded. Shrapnel to the arm. He kept fighting. Pope grabbed a rifle from a wounded Marine, aimed at muzzle flashes in the darkness, fired 3 rounds. A Japanese soldier collapsed 15 yards away. Pope moved to a different position. Standard infantry tactics. Never stay in one place after firing. The Japanese would target the muzzle flash. Pope had learned that lesson at Guadalcanal. The assault lasted 12 minutes. When it finally broke, 8 Japanese bodies lay on the northern slope. The Marines had used 11 grenades and approximately 70 rocks. The math was working. For every grenade thrown, the Marines threw 6 or 7 rocks first. The Japanese were reacting to every throw, taking cover, wasting time. The rock deception was forcing them to fight defensively, even while attacking. Burke called out from the western perimeter. Another group approaching from that direction. Smaller, maybe 8 men. The Japanese were now attacking from 2 sides simultaneously, trying to split the Marine defense. Pope ran to Burke's position. 3 Marines were already throwing rocks toward the approaching enemy. Pope watched the Japanese hesitate, dive for cover, waste precious seconds. Then the Marines threw 2 grenades. Both found their targets. By midnight, the Japanese had launched 5 separate attacks, small probes, medium assaults, 1 large coordinated strike from 2 directions. All had failed. The Marines had used 23 grenades, but they had thrown over 200 rocks. The Japanese had no idea the Americans were running a deception. They thought every thrown object was potentially lethal, and that belief was keeping them at a distance. Pope checked his ammunition. The Marines had maybe 300 rifle rounds left, 1 belt for the machine gun, 19 grenades, several hundred coral rocks. Dawn was 6 hours away, and the Japanese were regrouping for another assault. At 0100, the Japanese changed tactics. Instead of massed assaults, they started sending individual soldiers forward, infiltrators, moving slowly through the darkness, trying to get close enough to throw grenades into the Marine positions without being detected. Pope spotted the first one at 12 yards. Single muzzle flash from a Nambu pistol. Pope fired twice with his M1. The infiltrator went down. The infiltration attempts continued for the next hour. 3 Japanese soldiers, then 5, then 8. Each one trying to crawl close enough to the Marine perimeter to cause damage. The Marines couldn't throw rocks at individual targets moving that slowly. The rock trick only worked against groups making noise. Against silent infiltrators, the Marines had to rely on their rifles and their night vision. 2 Marines were wounded during this phase. One took a bullet through the shoulder. The other caught shrapnel from a Japanese grenade that landed 3 feet from his position. Both stayed on the line. There was nowhere to evacuate them. No corpsmen had made it up the ridge. The wounded Marines tied field dressings around their injuries and kept fighting. 24 Marines had become 22 effectives. Burke was still commanding the western flank despite his leg wound. At 0230, the Japanese launched their most sophisticated attack yet. Simultaneous assaults from 3 directions, north, east, and west. Approximately 50 to 60 soldiers total. The largest coordinated strike of the night. Pope realized immediately what was happening. The Japanese were trying to overwhelm the defense by attacking everywhere at once, forced the Marines to split their remaining grenades and ammunition across 3 separate firefights. The northern assault hit first. 20 men moving fast up the slope. No attempts at stealth, pure aggression. The machine gunner opened fire. The belt ran dry after 40 rounds. The gun was now useless. Dead weight. The Marines on the northern perimeter switched entirely to rifles and grenades. They threw rocks first. 5, 6, 7 rapid throws, then 2 grenades. The explosions stopped the Japanese advance temporarily. The eastern attack came 10 seconds later. 15 Japanese soldiers. The Thompson gunners engaged at 25 yards. Submachine gun fire ripped through the darkness. But the Thompsons only held 20-round magazines. Both guns went empty within seconds. The Marines switched to throwing. Rocks and grenades mixed together. The Japanese couldn't tell the difference. They took cover after every throw. The advance stalled. The western assault was the most dangerous. Burke's flank had the fewest Marines, only 4 men covering that entire approach. 12 Japanese soldiers hit that sector hard. Burke threw every rock within reach. Then he used his last 3 grenades. The explosions bought enough time for the other Marines to shift position and support his flank. Concentrated rifle fire finally broke the attack. The triple assault lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, the Marines had lost another man. Direct hit from a Japanese grenade. 21 Marines remained. Pope counted the ammunition. Less than 200 rifle rounds. 6 grenades. The machine gun was out of action. 1 Thompson was completely empty. The other had 1 magazine left. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but the Japanese had paid a heavy price. At least 20 bodies lay on the slopes around Hill 100, maybe more. The rock deception had worked again. Every Japanese attack had been slowed by the constant barrage of thrown objects. They were spending time taking cover, time repositioning, time hesitating. That hesitation was keeping the Marines alive. Pope checked his watch. 0300. 3 hours until dawn. 3 hours until the sun would expose every Marine position to direct observation from the surrounding Japanese-held ridges. 3 hours until artillery and mortar fire would make the position completely untenable. The Marines had to survive until first light. Then they would receive orders. Hold or withdraw. Either way, they had to make it to dawn. At 0315, the Japanese regrouped for what Pope knew would be their final major assault. He could hear them massing in the darkness below. Probably 60 to 80 men. Everything the Japanese had left in the immediate area. They would throw everything at this position. And the Marines had 6 grenades and 200 rounds to stop them. The final assault began at 0330. The Japanese came from all 3 sides simultaneously. 60 to 70 soldiers, screaming, running. A full suicidal charge meant to overwhelm the Marine position through sheer numbers and aggression. This wasn't tactical maneuvering. This was desperation. The Japanese commander had committed everything. Either they took Hill 100 in the next 15 minutes, or they would have to withdraw before dawn exposed them to American artillery. Pope's Marines opened fire with everything they had. M1 Garens, the last Thompson magazine, rifle fire at point-blank range. Japanese soldiers fell at 20 yards, 15 yards, 10 yards. They kept coming. The Marines threw their remaining rocks, handful after handful of coral stones flying through the darkness. Then the last 6 grenades, all 6 thrown within 30 seconds. The explosions created brief gaps in the Japanese assault, but there were too many attackers. The gaps closed immediately. At 5 yards, the Marines fixed bayonets. Standard Marine Corps doctrine. When the enemy gets close enough to see their faces, you use steel. 3 Japanese soldiers reached the northern perimeter. Hand-to-hand combat, rifle butts, bayonets, fists. 1 Marine went down with a Japanese soldier on top of him. Another Marine drove his bayonet through the attacker's back. Brutal, close, personal. This was no longer a firefight. This was a brawl. Burke's western flank collapsed. 4 Marines couldn't hold against 15 Japanese attackers. Burke himself killed 2 with his rifle before it ran empty. Then he grabbed his entrenching tool. Standard issue folding shovel, sharpened edge. He swung it like an axe, caught a Japanese soldier across the face. The man dropped. Burke kept swinging. The other Marines on that flank were fighting with knives, anything they could grab. The position was being overrun. Pope ran to the western side, fired his last 5 rounds, dropped 3 Japanese soldiers at 8 yards. His rifle clicked empty. No more ammunition. He looked around desperately. Spotted a wooden ammunition box, empty, heavy, 12 inches by 8 inches, solid construction. He grabbed it with both hands and hurled it at the nearest Japanese soldier. The box caught the man in the chest, knocked him backward off the ridge. A 300-foot drop. The man screamed all the way down. The other Marines saw Pope throw the ammunition box, started grabbing their own empty boxes, throwing them like projectiles. The boxes were heavier than rocks, more impact. One Marine threw a box that hit a Japanese soldier in the head. Skull fracture, instant death. Another box caught a soldier in the ribs, broke bones, put him out of the fight. The Marines were literally throwing anything they could grab. At 0400, the Japanese assault broke. Not because they were defeated, because they realized the Marines had stopped shooting. No more gunfire, no more grenades. The silence was revealing. The Japanese commander understood immediately. The Americans were out of ammunition. All he had to do was wait 5 more minutes, regroup his remaining men, launch one more attack. The Marines would have nothing left to throw. But 5 minutes was too long. The eastern horizon was starting to lighten. Not sunrise yet, just the first hint of dawn, pre-dawn twilight. In 30 minutes, American artillery observers would be able to see Hill 100. In 45 minutes, they could call fire missions on any Japanese positions visible from the valley below. The Japanese had run out of time. Pope counted his Marines. 14 still standing. 7 were wounded but functional. 3 were unconscious from wounds or exhaustion. 21 total. 3 had died during the final assault. The position was covered in empty ammunition boxes, spent rifle casings, coral rocks, and Japanese bodies. At least 30 enemy dead on the slopes, maybe more. Pope couldn't see well enough in the darkness to count accurately. The ammunition situation was catastrophic. 0 grenades. Approximately 30 rifle rounds scattered among 14 Marines. No machine gun ammunition. No Thompson rounds. But they had fists. They had knives. They had entrenching tools and empty ammunition boxes. And they had held this ridge for 8 straight hours against an enemy force that outnumbered them 20-1. Dawn was coming. The question was whether Battalion would order them to hold the position or withdraw under covering fire. Dawn came at 05:45. The sun broke over the eastern ridges and illuminated Hill 100 for the first time since the Marines had taken it. The light revealed the full extent of the night's carnage. Japanese bodies covered the northern, eastern, and western slopes, at least 35 dead. The coral ridge was stained dark. Empty shell casings littered every Marine position. Piles of coral rocks sat next to scattered grenade pins. The evidence of the desperate defense was everywhere. Pope's 14 standing Marines were visible now to every Japanese position on the surrounding ridges. The ridges to the west, the high ground to the north, East Mountain's main peak to the east. Japanese observers could see exactly how few defenders remained. They could count the Marines, see their exhausted faces, recognize how vulnerable the position had become. At 0600, the first Japanese artillery round impacted 30 yards north of the Marine perimeter. 70mm mountain gun. The Japanese had brought up artillery during the night, positioned it somewhere on the reverse slope of the northern ridge, out of sight from American observers in the valley. The gun crew had waited for daylight to get an accurate range on Hill 100. The second round landed 20 yards away. The third hit 15 yards from the nearest Marine position. The Japanese gunners were walking their fire directly onto the ridge. They had all the time in the world. The Marines had nowhere to go. No cover. The coral was too hard to dig into. All they could do was press themselves flat against the ground and hope the next round landed somewhere else. Burke tried to move from his position. His wounded leg buckled. He collapsed. 2 Marines dragged him to the center of the perimeter. The shrapnel wound from the previous night had worsened. Blood loss, possible infection. Burke needed immediate medical evacuation. So did the other 7 wounded Marines, but there was no way to get them off the ridge under direct artillery fire. At 0620, a runner from 1st Battalion reached the base of Hill 100. He had orders from Major Raymond Davis. Withdraw immediately. The position was untenable in daylight. Japanese artillery would kill every Marine on that ridge within the hour. Battalion would provide smoke cover for the withdrawal. The Marines had 3 minutes to prepare to move. Pope gathered his 14 functional Marines, explained the plan. They would carry the 3 unconscious wounded down first, then help the 7 walking wounded make the descent. Burke insisted he could walk with assistance. Pope assigned 2 Marines to support him. The withdrawal would be conducted in stages. First group down, second group covers, then switch. Standard infantry tactics for breaking contact under fire. At 0623, American artillery fired smoke rounds onto the slopes below Hill 100. White phosphorus shells. Dense white smoke rolled up the ridge face. The smoke wouldn't stop Japanese bullets or artillery rounds, but it would obscure the Marines from direct observation. The Japanese gunners would have to fire blind, less accurate, less deadly. Enough of an advantage to make the withdrawal possible. Pope's first group started down the northern slope, 4 Marines carrying 1 unconscious man. The route was treacherous, loose coral, steep gradient, the same path they had climbed 17 hours earlier while under fire. 60 Marines had been hit on this slope during the assault. Now 14 exhausted men were trying to descend while carrying their wounded. Japanese machine gun fire came through the smoke. The gunners were firing at sound, at movement, at anything they thought might be Marines. Bullets cracked past Pope's head, ricocheted off the coral. 1 round hit a Marine in the leg. He stumbled but kept moving. There was no stopping, no taking cover. The only direction was down. The first group reached the base of the ridge at 0635. They immediately set up a covering position, rifles aimed back up the slope, ready to suppress any Japanese attempt to pursue. The second group started down, Burke and 6 other wounded Marines, 2 unconscious men being carried. The smoke was thinning. The Japanese artillery had found the range again. Rounds were impacting on the upper portions of Hill 100, right where the Marines had spent the night. The timing of the withdrawal order had been perfect. 5 more minutes and the entire force would have been killed by artillery. Pope was the last Marine off the ridge. He took one final look at Hill 100. 24 Marines had climbed that slope yesterday afternoon. 8 were coming down alive and unwounded. The rest were casualties or still up there, dead. It would take 2 weeks before the Marines could return to recover the bodies. Pope and his 8 unwounded survivors reached the battalion aid station at 0700. The 3 unconscious Marines were immediately evacuated to the division hospital. Burke and the other wounded received treatment for their injuries, shrapnel removal, bandaging, plasma infusions for those who had lost significant blood. Pope himself had a piece of coral embedded in his left shoulder. He hadn't noticed it during the night. Adrenaline. The corpsman pulled it out with forceps. 3 stitches. Pope refused further treatment. Major Raymond Davis met Pope at the aid station. Davis commanded 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. His battalion had suffered 71% casualties over 6 days of fighting for these ridges. 240 men killed or wounded out of a battalion that had landed with 900. Davis looked at Pope's after-action report. 24 Marines held Hill 100 for 8 hours, repelled multiple company-strength Japanese attacks, used rocks mixed with grenades to deceive the enemy, fought hand-to-hand when ammunition ran out, 8 survivors. Davis immediately wrote a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. The Battle of Peleliu continued for another 2 months. The 1st Marine Division was pulled off the island on October 15th after 30 days of continuous combat. The Army's 81st Infantry Division replaced them. The fighting didn't end until November 27th, 73 days total. Major General Rupertus's prediction of a 4-day battle had been catastrophically wrong. The 1st Marine Division suffered 6,500 casualties, the highest casualty rate of any amphibious assault in Marine Corps history. 1 in 3 Marines who landed on Peleliu was killed or wounded. Hill 100 became a symbol of the entire Peleliu campaign, a small unit holding impossible ground against overwhelming odds. The rock-throwing tactic became legendary within the 1st Marine Division. Other units started carrying extra coral rocks during night defensive positions. The improvisation had worked once, maybe it would work again. The Japanese never adapted to the deception. Throughout the rest of the Peleliu campaign, Marines used the same trick. Throw rocks, throw grenades, make the enemy hesitate. Pope was evacuated to Peleliu Island on October 20th for rest and recovery. He was promoted to major in January 1945, assigned to study Japanese language at Yale University. He was still at Yale when the Medal of Honor recommendation was approved. The citation was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in April 1945. But Roosevelt died on April 12th before the presentation ceremony could be scheduled. President Harry Truman took office on April 12th. One of his first official acts as president was to schedule a White House ceremony for Medal of Honor recipients. The ceremony was held on June 15, 1945, Truman's first Medal of Honor presentation as president. Pope stood in the East Room of the White House with 13 other recipients, 7 Marines, 6 Army soldiers. All had earned the medal in the Pacific Theater. All had survived actions where most of their units had been killed. Truman read Pope's citation aloud. The president emphasized specific details: the hand-to-hand combat, the rocks mixed with grenades, the 8-hour defense with 24 men reduced to 8 survivors. Truman told Pope that his actions represented everything the Medal of Honor was meant to recognize: extraordinary valor in the face of impossible odds, leadership that inspired men to fight beyond normal human endurance, tactical innovation that saved lives. Pope received the medal at age 25, the same age he had been on Hill 100. He returned to Massachusetts after the ceremony, joined the Marine Corps Reserve, commanded a reserve infantry battalion until the Korean War broke out in 1950. He was called back to active duty, served another tour, then returned to civilian life permanently, worked in banking, raised 2 sons, stayed connected to Bowdoin College, where he had graduated in 1941. The rock-throwing tactic was never officially adopted by the Marine Corps. There was no field manual entry, no training doctrine, but veterans passed the story to younger Marines. The story of Captain Pope and Hill 100 became part of Marine Corps oral history, proof that innovation and determination could overcome superior firepower, proof that 8 men could hold a position if they refused to surrender. Pope rarely spoke publicly about Peleliu. When asked about the night defense, he always emphasized his Marines, the 8 who survived, the 16 who died. He insisted he had simply done what any Marine officer would do: lead from the front, fight until ordered to withdraw, take care of the men under your command. Pope left active duty in 1946, returned to Massachusetts, found work at a bank in Boston, started as a junior officer, worked his way up through the organization over 37 years. He married Eleanor Hawkins in 1942, his high school sweetheart. They raised 2 sons, Lawrence and Ralph. Lawrence eventually became a United States ambassador to Chad from 1993 to 1996. Both sons went into public service, following their father's example of duty. Pope stayed connected to Bowdoin College for the rest of his life, served on the governing boards for 27 years, from 1961 to 1988. He established the Pope Scholarship Fund in the 1980s to help students who couldn't afford tuition. He also helped establish the Haldane Cup, an award presented to seniors who demonstrate leadership and character. The cup was named after Captain Andrew Haldane, Pope's classmate and friend. Haldane commanded K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. He was killed on Peleliu, shot by a Japanese sniper on October 12, 1944, 3 weeks after Pope's fight on Hill 100. The college awarded Pope an honorary Doctor of Laws degree in 1987. The citation mentioned his military service, his business career, his dedication to education. Pope rarely spoke about the Medal of Honor. He considered it a symbol of his Marines' sacrifice, not his personal achievement. When people asked about Hill 100, he always said the same thing: 8 men survived because 24 fought together. Pope retired from banking in 1983. He and Eleanor moved to Brunswick, Maine, stayed close to Bowdoin, close to their sons. They spent summers on Great Pond in Belgrade Lakes, winters on Amelia Island in Florida. A quiet retirement. No publicity. No interviews unless specifically requested by military historians. In September 2008, Pope and Eleanor moved to the Hill House Assisted Living Facility in Bath, Maine. Both were experiencing declining health. Eleanor died on January 22, 2009, 89 years old, 66 years of marriage. Pope followed 6 months later. He died on July 16, 2009, his 90th birthday, the same date he was born in 1919. Pope and Eleanor were cremated, buried together at Arlington National Cemetery on September 15, 2009, exactly 65 years after the Marines landed on Peleliu. The funeral was private, family only, no military ceremony. Pope had specifically requested a quiet burial. He didn't want attention. Even in death, he remained humble about his wartime service. The Medal of Honor citation is preserved at the National Medal of Honor Museum. Pope's story is part of the Marine Corps historical record. 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, maintains the Hill 100 defense as a case study in small unit tactics and defensive innovation. The rock-throwing deception is taught at Marine Corps officer training, not as doctrine, but as an example of adaptive thinking under extreme pressure. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about Marines who saved lives with rocks and bare fists. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Captain Everett Pope doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.